He knew that the deal would take place at least half an hour before the end of his presentation. The clue was a quiet conversation between John Simmons, president of GPC Hotels, and Brad Clark, vice president of operations, before both smiled and then watched the rest of the presentation in a relaxed manner. Now his only question was how big the order would be. He could only hope they would choose the full sentence. There were 5 people in the meeting room, including 2 senior managers, Brenda Crocker and David Petty, 2 young clerks from the purchasing department, joined 30-year-old Andy Carlson in his presentation to the 2 decision-makers. Andy gave the presentation using PowerPoint on his laptop, which was projected onto a screen at the end of the meeting room. He also had a working 6x6 defibrillator to show them. Feeling no longer under pressure to sell them on his proposition, Andy relaxed too, and the optional equipment, after sales, service, and warranty sections of the presentation flew by. When he finished, John and Brad stood and applauded him, saying that his presentation had been wonderfully done, and they were ready to discuss the purchase of portable defibrillator equipment for all of their facilities. One of the ideas Andy sold was the ability to advertise the presence of defibrillators in case of heart attacks in exercise areas, swimming pools, or even restaurants and bars. Knowing that many of their clients are executives and business travelers who value such benefits helped him too. The final highlight was the collaboration between Brenda and David from the hotel chain's own purchasing department. The 2 of them volunteered to be Andy's guinea pigs when it came time to demonstrate the ease of use of the equipment. David Petty became a patient, apparently suffering from a heart attack, headlong in one of the conference room chairs. Brenda Crocker was a hotel employee who came to the rescue with a defibrillator. The ease with which Brenda was able to read the instructions and connect the machine to David, and then verify that he did not need an electrical shock to restart his heart, was impressive. Moving the 2 sensors to part of the conference room table to show that he really had no heartbeat and was in desperate need of shock added a bit of humor, but made the intended point. The 5 of them chatted amiably about the equipment for about 15 minutes, until the 2 executives announced that they had their next meeting soon, but they wanted the purchasing department to purchase 1 unit for each property, plus an additional unit for those hotels that had ample exercise areas great to sell public memberships. Andy's quick mental calculation told him that deciding on the extra units would net him an extra $1,500 in commission. It was hard not to smile when he heard the news. The moment the door closed behind the 2 executives, Brenda and David each shook Andy's hand in congratulations. "I'm so glad they decided to do this," Brenda exclaimed. "My grandfather and one of my uncles died of heart attacks, and I'm sure your machine could have saved them if it had been available back then." She let go of his hand and gave him a quick hug. "Great job, Andy. You sold me a month ago when you first came in. I'm just glad we were able to get the bosses to watch your presentation. Your product practically sold itself, I think," David said, continuing to shake Andy's hand. "I just want to thank you both for your support and help. This will be a very large order for me, and I appreciate all your help." Andy smiled widely as he returned Brenda's hug and their handshake. The 3 of them returned to the purchasing department, where all the necessary orders and contracts were signed. In less than an hour, all the paperwork was safely stowed in Andy's briefcase, and he began to relax. He excused himself and went to the men's room, but before returning to the purchasing office, he decided to call his wife, Kathy. It was already after 16 Joe, and she should have been home at that time. Her typical workday as a secretary at a law firm lasted from 8:00 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. There was no answer on the phone at home, so Andy decided to leave her a message. "Hi, honey. Just calling to say I had a really good day. I'll be driving back in the morning and should be home for dinner. I have a couple more calls on the way back. Love you." Andy could hardly believe that his biggest contract ever had actually been signed. This sale was for over $250,000, and although he had to make discounts that would reduce his commission percentage, he was still going to earn almost $15,000 in commission. With that money in his account, he knew he could get Katie interested in starting their family again. Her only objection to pregnancy was the lack of a financial cushion in their account. This commission would solve this problem once and for all. Back in the purchasing department, Andy asked Brenda and David to join him in the break room. They were very supportive and helpful to him, and he wanted to reward them both. He didn't really want to involve the entire office team in this, so once he got them away from their colleagues, he said, "I really owe you a lot for helping me with this contract. Can I take you both out to dinner tonight? Would that be okay?" Brenda and David looked at each other, and Brenda said, "I'd love to join, Andy. How about you, David?" "I need to call my wife first to see if she's okay. If she's okay, I'll be happy to join." David left the group to call his wife, and while he was gone, Brenda put her hands on Andy's shoulders and gave him another quick congratulatory hug. If he weren't married, he would be interested in trying to get to know Brenda better. She was about 25, the same height as him, 178 cm, with long dark blonde hair, green eyes, and a very sweet face. He wasn't usually very good at judging women's sizes, but he guessed her figure to be 96-71, 96. He definitely knew that she looked very attractive in her white blouse and dark skirt. Although her clothes were not provocative, they were styled to highlight her best features, her full bust and slender hips. David returned a moment later, smiling, and said, "My wife says I should have a good time. She's going to go over to her mom's house and have dinner with her. So where are we going?" "I'm staying at your local hotel, so how about we meet at the restaurant there at 5:30 p.m.? Will that be okay? I have a couple of calls when I get back to my room, and I'd like to freshen up." 5:30 p.m. was good for both Brenda and David, so they parted ways with an agreement to meet there. Andy headed to his hotel room where he confirmed his appointments for the next day and then called home again. This time his call went unanswered again, but this time he didn't leave a message. Instead, he called his wife's cell phone, only to find out that she was not working at that time. Sometimes he wondered why she even had a phone if she rarely turned it on when he tried to contact her. Andy was the first to arrive in the dining room and quickly settled down at a quiet table for three. After a couple of minutes, Brenda and David joined him, and they headed to his reserved table. Brenda sat next to Andy, and David took the seat opposite him. The three of them ordered pre-dinner drinks and sat enjoying each other's company. Andy made a point of thanking them again for their help with the order, and together they drank to his success. They had a leisurely dinner, including a couple of glasses of wine each, and soon it was 8 o'clock. All three of them were starting to feel the effects of their drinking, and after they finished off their dinner with light desserts, they decided to go to the bar for a while. At the bar, they chose a booth near the dance floor, and Brenda sat on one side, quickly pulling Andy along with her to sit next to her. He noticed that she moved right towards him after he sat down, but that didn't bother him. Before she joined them in the dining room, she had clearly popped home to change into an elegant black dress that discreetly showed off a bit of cleavage. It was nice to sit next to the most beautiful woman in the bar. Although Andy had no intentions of having an affair with Brenda, the company of a beautiful woman was something he couldn't refuse. He noticed that David was stealing glances at her through and wondered if David had seen Brenda outside the office before. The dress fit her much more attractively than the office clothes she had worn before. Andy had never noticed David paying special attention to her before. They sat in the booth for about half an hour when the music started. As the first song began, David said, "Come on, Brenda, let's dance. We've been working together for 2 years, and I've never seen you outside the office. I have to leave soon, so how about a dance?" He smiled at her and extended his hand across the table. Andy stood up to let them go to the small dance floor where they joined other couples. As they danced, Andy literally had a prime vantage point. He couldn't help but notice how smoothly Brenda moved to the beat of the music. David was inexperienced in dancing, and it showed. As Andy watched them, he couldn't help but compare Brenda to his wife, Kathy. Katie was short, about 168 cm, and much more petite. Her short dark hair was also very different, and she was not as generously endowed in the chest area. It's not that he didn't like it. He always told her that more than a handful was too much. Andy knew she felt left out in this regard. While Brenda and David danced, Andy tried to call his wife again. Again, there was no answer either at home or on her cell phone, and he wondered where she could be. His thoughts were interrupted by the return of the dancers, and he stood up to give Brenda room. "That was great, Brenda," David said. "I should invite you over to teach me and my wife how to dance properly. We're both not very good at it. Speaking of my wife, I better head home before she comes for me." He laughed and took his drink. There were only a few drops left in the glass, and when he drank them, David stood up and said, "I'm leaving before I change my mind. See you tomorrow, Brenda. Good luck with the clients tomorrow, Andy. You're a good salesman, so I'm sure you'll do a great job with them." He laughed when Brenda and Andy told him to drive carefully. "I only live 3 blocks from here, so I walked. Behave." They both laughed, and before David left, Andy stood up and moved to the opposite side of the table to sit opposite Brenda. "See, David, there's nothing to worry about. I'm happily married, and although I know it will be difficult, I'll try to resist Brenda's charms." He laughed again, and Brenda joined in the laughter, sticking out her tongue. Together they waved goodbye to David as he left. Brenda looked across the table at Andy and said, "So you don't find me irresistible?" She smiled as she said it, and Andy hesitated before answering. "If I were single, I would still be sitting on that side of the booth. But I am not single. I would, however, like to dance with you. You dance well, and although I know that you are not your level, I like a good slow dance." The band had just started a new set of slow songs, so Andy held out his hand, and together they walked to the dance floor. Their dance was everything Andy had hoped for, and he couldn't help but notice how skillfully Brenda danced. Mostly he managed to restrain himself from snuggling too close to Brenda during the dance, but there were a couple of times when she pulled him closer. Finally, the set ended, and he offered to take their seats again. "That was really great, Brenda. You're definitely one of the best dancers I've ever been with. I'm sure all the other guys here are jealous of me." Brenda blushed and said, "Thank you. I have to admit, I've been dancing for 8 years. I'd be a little disappointed if you didn't notice," she laughed. "That definitely explains a lot. You can probably see a lot of mistakes in my movements," he laughed. "It's almost unfair to us poor guys. I'm sure you could make us all look pretty stupid on the dance floor if you wanted to." "I wouldn't do that to you, Andy. It wouldn't be nice, and I like you." She looked at him through her glass as she finished her drink. Andy ordered more drinks, and they continued to drink, dance, talk, and laugh together for the next 2 hours. It was almost midnight when Andy realized that he had drunk a little more than he should have. Since he had to drive home in the morning, he decided it was time to call it a night. "Well, Brenda, I think it's time for me to call it a day. It's getting late. I hope you won't be offended or think I didn't enjoy myself. You're great company and a fabulous dancer." "Thank you, and you're right, it really is late." Brenda stood at the end of the booth and waited for Andy to stand and escort her out of the lounge. Since they had already paid the bill and Andy had already taken care of all the financial matters, they were able to leave without any delays. As they crossed the hall, Brenda said, "Do you have a minibar in your room? I could use one last drink before calling the cab. If that's okay with you, of course." Andy visibly hesitated before answering, "I guess it's possible. I see there are coolers and half-liter bottles of wine in the fridge. We could share a cooler if you want. Just something for the road. I guess I should say that in a taxi," she laughed. "Don't think I'm nervous about going to your room with you. I trust you." Andy glanced at her quickly and said, "I haven't even thought about whether you need to worry. Rest assured, I'll behave." They walked to the elevators together and soon headed to Andy's room on the second floor. As soon as they entered, Andy moved to the minibar and began checking its contents. He pulled out a raspberry cooler and asked Brenda, "Is this okay?" He held it facing Brenda and nearly dropped it when he saw her for the first time. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing only a black bra and panties. Her dress lay on the arm of the chair at the foot of the bed. "Maybe we should forget about the drinks, Andy. I can think of a much nicer way to spend our time, she said with a smile, walking up to him. Andy's first thought was to tell her, "No, I can't. I'm married to Katie," but the words never came out of his mouth. Instead, he watched silently as she approached him. They were having sex when his wife came into their room. He could see the shock on his wife's face. "Bastard! You bastard!" Katie went from shock to rage, and by this time Brenda was looking back at Katie. He started trying to approach his wife, wanted to hug her and tell her that everything would be fine. But as soon as he started moving, she started waving the bag she was holding in her right hand. It was almost 6 a.m. when Andy woke up feeling a sharp pain in the back of his head. He opened his eyes, looked around as best he could, but could not understand where he was. There was a movement to his right, and a moment later Brenda appeared in his field of vision. "What? Where am I? What happened? Katie, where is Katie? I need to talk to her. Where is she?" Andy tried to turn his head further, hoping to see his wife. "You're in the hospital, Andy. You hit your head. I called an ambulance because I couldn't wake you up." Brenda's face showed concern. "How did I get hit?" Andy was confused, not understanding why he couldn't remember how he got hurt. "Katie, where is Katie?" "I don't know where she went. I didn't see her again after she hit you. They had a scan on you, and there was no fracture. They think it was just a bruise and a cut. You might have a slight concussion. I need to call her. Do you know where my cell phone is?" Andy looked around the bedside table, trying to find his phone. He needed to call Katie. He had to try to explain everything to her. Brenda walked out of sight for a moment and then returned with his cell phone. "Here it is, Andy. After they brought you, I returned to the hotel and collected your things. Everything here is yours: briefcase, personal belongings, clothes, and suitcase. I even checked you out of the hotel and brought your car here. I asked if they would charge for cleaning, but I was told that this would be the responsibility of the cleaning staff. I hope you don't mind that I did this. I was told that after the injection you were given, you will sleep for a couple of hours, so I went back to the hotel to keep myself busy." And he dialed Katie's number on his cell phone as he said, "No, it's okay. I'm glad you did it for me. I need to get home as soon as possible to talk to my wife." Katie's phone went unanswered again, so he left her a message. "Katie, this is Andy. I need to talk to you. Please call me on my cell phone as soon as you receive my message. I love you." The events of the previous evening had come back to Andy by this time, but there were things he couldn't understand. My wife, where did she come from? How did she suddenly appear there? As much as he asked these questions to Brenda, he was also thinking out loud. He couldn't understand how Katie ended up in his room. Brenda paused for a moment and then said, "I think I know what happened. I asked the front desk how your wife got her room key and was told that an intern gave her the key when she showed your identification. The clerk at the counter tried to stop him, but it was too late. They usually do not issue room keys when the person is not a hotel guest. He heard her say that she just flew in to surprise you." Andy had tears in his eyes as he said, "It really was a surprise to both of us. I couldn't imagine she would ever forgive me. I've never done anything like this before since we got married, and that's when that time she must have caught me. I feel so guilty." Brenda got a very serious look on her face and said, "You're not the only one who feels guilty. Everything that happened was my fault. Ever since I first met you, I've fantasized about being with you. When you agreed to have the last drink with me in your room, it fit into my fantasy, and I decided to fulfill it. I had the choice to say no. It's what I had to do, no matter how much I liked you." Andy looked away, wiping away tears, and continued, "My wife is not one to forgive easily, and I'm really not sure how she'll deal with this. She's always been a little suspicious of my business trips. She's quite insecure, and that will only fuel her insecurities." Brenda thought for a moment and then said, "I could call her and explain what I did. I could make her understand that what happened was not your initiative. I doubt she'll believe you. In fact, I really doubt she'll want to talk to you at all. Once you introduce yourself as another woman, I'm sure she'll just hang up. but thanks for the offer." Andy tried to get up. He was about to try to get out of bed when the nurse came in. "Stay here. Don't try to get up, Mr. Colin Carlson. We need to take a good look at you to make sure you don't have any brain injuries. Just lie down and I'll get to the neurologist right away." The nurse checked the sensors connected to Andy before leaving the room. Brenda walked over to the bed and took Andy's hand. "I'm so sorry it turned out this way. I really don't think there's anything left for me to do here, so I'm going to leave. I think I should take a sick day today since I haven't slept all night. Please call me if you think I should talk to your wife." She squeezed his hand before stepping back and leaving the room. Andy spent another 8 hours in this room before he was discharged. It turned out that apart from a cut on the back of the head, a large lump, and a constant mild headache, there were no other injuries. He was told he was fine to drive, and by 3 p.m., he had finished packing his things in the car and was ready to make the 4-hour drive home. While he waited in the hospital, he tried several times to contact his wife, but was unable to reach her. He left messages for her at home, at work, and on her cell phone. It seemed like she was either out of town or didn't want to talk to him. He assumed the latter. He was also forced to cancel 2 sales meetings he had scheduled for the previous evening. He knew his first priority was to get home as soon as possible. While he was waiting for some time to be discharged, he opened his wife's bag to see what was in it. The contents told him the story of why and how his wife appeared in his hotel room. Inside, he found the Victoria's Secret lingerie he bought her for her last birthday, along with her scented bath oils, some makeup, and spare clothes. On top of all this were 2 receipts, one for a one-way flight from Indianapolis to Columbus, and the other for a taxi from their house to the airport. She decided to suddenly join him on the last night of his business trip, clearly with the intention of spending a night of passion with her husband and then returning home together. The trip home was uneventful, interrupted only by his repeated attempts to contact his wife. He started calling several of their mutual friends, asking if anyone knew where Katie was. Neither of them spoke to her or knew where she was, although his conversation with Katie's best friend, Cindy Willis, was a little strange. She wasn't her usual bubbly self. In fact, she seemed quite abrupt. Despite her denial of knowing Katie's whereabouts, he wasn't sure he should trust her. It was almost 19 when he arrived at his house. The house was dark and Katie's car was gone. He carried his suitcase, Katie's bag, and briefcase into the house. He put the suitcase and bag in the bedroom and immediately noticed that half of Katie's shared closet was empty. A quick inspection confirmed that the suitcase and her toiletries were also missing from the bathroom. It was obvious that Katie had left their home, and Andy could only hope that he could find her to explain himself and ask for forgiveness. He quickly checked the entire house and did not find a single note explaining where she could have gone. He checked his answering machine, and the only messages on it were his own. He erased the messages before starting calling people in their address book who he thought could help him track down Katie. With one exception, no one seemed to know where she was, and everyone was surprised that he was looking for her. The exception was her sister Debbie. When he reached Debbie and introduced himself, she called him a creep and hung up. When he tried to call her again, her line was constantly busy. He could only assume that Katie had told her what happened, and she was now keeping her phone out of reach. If she lived closer, he would have gone to her, but she lived almost an hour away. His next call was a second call to her friend Cindy, as he was pretty sure after the first call that she was talking to Katie. When she answered, her voice was cheerful enough, but when he asked, "Cindy, can you tell me where Katie is?" her voice became distinctly icy. "Yes, she's here. She's not going to talk to you. You hurt her really bad, Andy." Andy sighed and then said, "I know, Cindy. I need to talk to her to explain what happened and ask for forgiveness." There were muffled sounds on the phone, and Andy realized that 2 women were talking in the background. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but a moment later Cindy was back on the line. "Katie says she'll meet you at the Corral at 9 o'clock. The Corral was a local bar with a dance floor, a place Andy and Katie rarely went to. Its atmosphere was not great as it was known to be a rather rough place. Why does she want to meet me there? I'd rather just talk to her here or at your place. There were muffled words in the background again, but soon Cindy said, "It's there or nothing, Andy." Andy knew he needed to talk to her, so he said, "Okay, if that's what it takes. Just tell her I love her." There was a note of resignation in Andy's voice, as he knew he had to agree to whatever she asked in order to see her as soon as possible. "It's weird for you to show your affection, Andy," Cindy said. I know." Andy's voice shook as he said this, as Cindy's comment really hurt him. He said goodbye and slowly hung up. There were still almost 2 hours before he had to meet Katie, so he cooked himself a bland dinner, showered, and changed into clean clothes. When he finished all this, he still had time, so he spent it thinking about what he would say to Katie. By the time he was ready to go to the corral, he had convinced himself that he could convince Katie to forgive him and come home with him. Andy entered the corral at 9 o'clock sharp. He looked around but didn't see Katie anywhere, so he sat down at an empty table. He sat looking at his hands, silently praying that the conversation with his wife would go well, when she suddenly slid into the seat opposite him. The shock was clear on his face as he looked up. "Where did you come from?" "I looked around, but I didn't see you anywhere." After the words left his mouth, he felt that this was not the best way to start a conversation with her. There was no smile on Katie's face as she said, "I just came out of the restroom. You wanted to talk to me, so here I am. I've been trying to reach you all day, Katie. I'm begging you to forgive me." Tears began to form in his eyes before he finished saying those few words. "Were you in such a hurry to seek my forgiveness that you didn't return home until the evening? I suppose after I caught you, it was normal for you to return to your studies with your blonde, which I so inappropriately interrupted." Katie almost spat the words out as her eyes flashed with anger at him. "Oh no, it wasn't like that. I was in the hospital until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I cut my head, look." Andy turned his head and shifted in his seat so that Katie could see where the hair had been shaved and tape had been placed on the stitches. For the first time, concern appeared on Katie's face. "What happened? How did you do it?" Andy hesitated and looked down at his hands for a moment before looking up at his wife and saying, "When you threw your duffel bag at me, I fell and hit my head on the end table. I was unconscious when they took me to the hospital, and they wouldn't let me leave until they examined me. It turned out that at worst I might have a very mild concussion." Katie still had a look of concern on her face as she said, "I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize you fell. All I could think about was you and that. Big-breasted, blonde. I see it every time I close my eyes." "I'm so sorry about that, Katie. I've never done anything like this before, and for you to come in at that exact moment." He was at a loss for words and sat there, trying to figure out what else to say. The anger on Katie's face returned as he spoke. "Don't try to convince me that this was the first time. I just knew you were cheating on me when you left on those business trips. I checked my organizer at work, and I found 13 out-of-town trips that you took that I noted. I'm sure you cheated on me on all these trips." "It was the first time, Katie. I've never done this before. You have to believe me. It just happened." Andy looked around as if searching for the right words, words that would convince her of his sincerity. Katie's eyes lit up as she said, "I don't believe you." Andy realized that he wouldn't be able to get very far on this topic with Katie, so he decided to change the subject a little. "I made a deal with GPC Hotels. It will be almost $15,000 in commission. We can start a family. I want us to get through this somehow so you can have my children." He looked at Katie and tears appeared in his eyes. "Right now, I don't even know if I want you back." Katie's face returned to anger as she said, "How do you know you're not the father anymore? Maybe she's pregnant with your baby, or maybe she gave you something you'll remember. You understand now. I'll have to get tested in case one of your lovers infected me through you." A look of horror appeared on Andy's face. I didn't even think about it. I'll go get tested right away." "You don't need to get tested. I told you I've never done this before. Honestly. She hesitated for a few moments and then continued. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I've already decided how I'm going to get back at you for this. Andy now became curious and asked, "What do you mean, get back at me?" Katie's face now showed determination. Turning to point to the back of the room, she said, "See Cindy over there with those two guys? The one on the right, Bob Sherman, is my witness tonight. He doesn't know yet, but he'll soon find out how lucky he is. Maybe I will be happy." A look of panic appeared on Andy's face as he said, "No, Katie, don't say that. You're not a woman of easy virtue. I won't have my wife intentionally having sex with some guy." His voice began to rise as he spoke, and by the time he finished, several other bar patrons had turned to look at them. "Just look at me. I might even go and get a wax tomorrow and get a nice tattoo over it. Maybe I should get a nice rose. You like them," she said sarcastically. Andy became increasingly desperate. "Please, Katie, don't say that. I can't stand the thought of you with someone else. It would kill me." "Well, welcome to my world, Andy. I'm going to give back as good as I got it. And don't think about coming back here to cause trouble. I already warned Tiny that you might cause trouble." Tiny was a local celebrity whose real name was unknown to almost everyone. His nickname came from the fact that he weighed nearly 300 pounds, most of it muscle. Earlier in life, he had been a champion bodybuilder, but now his fame was as a regular security guard at the corral. He had a well-known angry streak, and no sober person would deliberately pick a fight with him. "I don't care about Tiny. I won't let you do this. What I did was not planned. Please give me a chance to fix this. Don't do such a thing." Andy grabbed her hand, pleading with her. Katie quickly pulled her hand out of his grip and slid off the seat. "I already told you, just look at me." She turned and walked to the back of the bar, where she sat down next to the tall, well-built man she was pointing at. He had blonde hair, a crew cut, and a military air about his manner. There was a National Guard base nearby, and Andy wondered if Bob Sherman was from there. And he couldn't believe what Katie said about her intentions. He could understand that in some ways it might seem fair, but there was no way he could allow his wife to have sex with another man, even if he himself had made the mistake of pursuing a relationship with Brenda. He decided that the only thing he could do was get his wife out of the bar if necessary. Once he made that decision, he slipped out of his seat and headed to a table in the back. As he approached the table where the two couples were sitting, he could see the smirk on Bob's face. Cindy and her companion looked at him with amusement, while Katie simply looked determined. "I want you to come home with me right now, Katie. We need to have a serious conversation, and this is not the place for it. What you are planning is not the solution. It will only make things worse." Andy addressed Katie, completely ignoring the other three at the table. He was so focused on his words that he didn't even notice Tiny quietly approaching him from behind. Andy only became aware of Tiny's presence when he said, "There will be no disturbances here." Secret stood at 6'4" and had shaved his head for as long as Andy had known him. His dark eyes were glued to Andy's face as he spoke. "Don't interfere, Secrets. This is between my wife and me." There was a fight between them. "Tiny, what did you do to him?" Katie screamed. "Don't worry, he's fine. He'll come around soon, I'm sure. He's not my first dance partner." Secrets laughed as he stood there with Andy on his shoulder. "I'll just take it to his car. You can come and show me what she's like if you want." Katie followed Tiny out of the bar as the other patrons laughed at Andy. Andy's car was parked quite close to the door, and he left it unlocked. After Katie opened the door, Tiny placed Andy in the passenger seat with little effort, as if he were a rag doll. Katie saw that Andy was breathing normally, and after checking his pulse, the concern left her face. She knew Andy would be okay, and a minute later, she followed Tiny back to the bar. Andy came to his senses after about half an hour, but it took him several minutes to realize where he was and remember what happened. His jaw was sore, and the headache he'd started the day with was back with a vengeance. Once he collected his thoughts, he decided to return to the bar, determined for Katie to leave with him. As he entered, several customers pointed at him, and he heard several laughs. He headed to the back of the bar, more determined than ever that he would leave there with Katie, only to find that the table she had been sitting at was now empty. He turned around in shock, looking around for her, Cindy, and their two companions. None of them were visible in the bar. As he looked around, he saw Tiny sitting at the end of the bar. He approached him, trying to keep his hands in front of him in the universal sign of peaceful intentions. "Where is my wife, Secrets? Did she say where she was going?" "I have no idea, dude. They left right after I put you in the car. No problem. I'm just doing my job." Secrets looked at him thoughtfully, ready to defend himself again if necessary. And he didn't say anything. He simply turned and walked slowly towards the door. He couldn't stop Katie from her crazy plan for revenge. Tears began to form in his eyes as he reached the door, and he was indifferent to the laughter behind his back. He drove around the city aimlessly for the next hour, hoping to find Katie's car, but realizing it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. He eventually decided to just go home, accepting the fact that his wife was spending time with Mr. Petty-Lucky. When he entered his home, he was a broken man, beaten in spirit as well as in body. He spent the next 3 hours slowly drinking into a near stupor, mourning what he had lost because of his stupid night in a hotel room in Columbus. His thoughts first focused on his own failure, then moved on to curse Brands for tempting her, but he ended up going back to curse yourself for your weakness. He tried not to seriously blame Katie for her actions. He knew his wife well and could almost understand how she could come to the conclusion that her decision was the right one. She saw things quite black and white, and his cheating on her meant that she had to do the same to punish him. He finally lay down on the bed and lay down on the covers, where he quickly fell asleep. When he woke up the next morning, he realized it was Friday, and he had to head to the office to settle his bills for the week and hand in his huge order from the GPC hotel chain. Now he should have been excited about the prospect of the huge commission he was about to receive, but all he could think about when he woke up was Katie. As the memories of what she planned to do came back to him, his stomach churned and he barely made it to the bathroom, where he emptied his stomach into the toilet. It was almost 10 a.m. before his stomach calmed down enough for him to go to work. The whole office was delighted when he handed in the documents for the order from GPC Hotels. It was the largest order they'd ever received, and it seemed like every employee came over to congratulate him. If his mind hadn't been so completely consumed with thoughts of his wife and what she had done last night, this could have been one of the best days of his life. His order was the equivalent of hitting a grand slam in the World Series, and at that moment it meant very, very little to him. During the day, he tried to contact Katie at work, but was told that she was sick. Calls to Cindy's house and to Katie's cell phone went unanswered. Andy spent the day imagining his wife in Mr. B's Lucky's arms, and it tormented him inside. When the day finally ended and Andy returned home, he tried to contact his wife again at Cindy's. This time he got through, and when Cindy answered, he said, "Cindy, please let me talk to Kathy. We need to solve this before everything collapses completely. She told me to tell you that she will meet you again at the Corral Bar tonight at 9. She doesn't want to talk to you until then," Cindy replied. "What do you mean in the corral? Why can't she just come home so we can somehow get over this? I don't feel comfortable with this. I have to talk to her now." "I'm just telling you what she said, Andy. She's not here right now, but if she calls me, I'll tell her what you said. If she doesn't call you, just meet her at the corral at 9, Cindy said. Andy realized there was nothing more he could do, so he spent the time trying to eat another bad dinner and lying on the bed, trying not to imagine Katie with Bob Sherman. He was not very successful at this and realized that it would be almost impossible for him to get rid of these pictures in his imagination. Only by convincing himself that her actions were equivalent to his own did he smog hope that one day he can overcome this. The phrase, "the pot can't call the kettle black," came into his head several times. Finally, just before 9 o'clock that evening, he made his second trip to the corral. Since it was Friday, the parking lot was already almost full. He found a parking spot and entered the noisy bar. He didn't see Katie at first and walked around most of the place before finally spotting her in a booth with 3 other people, 2 men and a woman. Andy expected her to be alone and was a little upset that she wasn't. It took him only a moment to approach their table. There was determination on Andy's face as he said, "Katie, I'm here, so come home with me where we can talk. We need to sort this mess out." Katie looked quickly at him, somewhat surprised that he had appeared so suddenly next to her. "Sorry, Andy. I think you misunderstood me. I'm not going to return home until I take revenge on you for all your 13 trips to other cities." She pointed to the woman across from her and said, "This is Tara White and her husband, Brent. I work with her." She turned in her seat and pointed at the man sitting next to her. "This is Eric Mitchell, a family friend. He is my witness today." There was obvious irritation on Andy's face. "I already told you that this was the only such event. This is madness. This is your revenge. I want you to come home with me right now." "No, I'll stay. Eric just bought me a drink, and I'm going to finish it." Andy pulled his wallet out of his pocket and pulled out a $10 bill. He threw it on the table, saying, "Here's the money for the drink." As soon as the bill landed on the table, Tiny Layer led him out of the bar. "You don't come in here anymore. If you come in, I'll call the police for trespassing, and I'll take you out myself. Next time I won't be so soft." Secrets, he said this without haste or emotion. Andy realized that this was a speech he had probably given many times. "Please, I need to talk to my wife. If I can't come in, can you bring her out here to talk to me?" Andy was now desperately trying to stop Katie from continuing her terrible revenge plan. "Your problems have nothing to do with me. I have my own job. You can talk to your wife tomorrow. Don't come back here." Tiny turned and walked back into the bar, leaving Andy in the parking lot, tears shining in his eyes again. He stood for several minutes, clenching and unclenching his fists, contemplating the possibility of entering the corral again. Finally, he turned and walked slowly towards his car. Andy sat in the car for a couple more minutes, trying to decide what to do. He finally started the car and slowly pulled out of the parking lot. If he had looked in the rearview mirror before turning left onto the street, he would have seen Katie standing at the door. Corral, looking very worried and with his wallet in his hand. While Andy had been a broken man after Katie's decision the day before, he was now completely crushed. He pulled into his driveway, although he didn't remember returning from the corral. He staggered into his home, completely broken, and with no hope for the future of his marriage. The woman he loved chose a path he could not accept or live with. He knew that he would have to decide what to do with his life, and to do this he needed a clear mind. He walked into the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, eventually sitting at the kitchen table with a full cup, deciding his future. Up until this point, his future had always included Katie, and now he sat wondering what he could do to live without her. He knew he wasn't sure about forgiving her night with her first lover, but he was absolutely sure he couldn't forgive her night with Eric Mitchell or the others she apparently had planned as part of her revenge plan. As he began to plan, the question of money came to him, and he reached for his wallet, only to find that it was missing. At that moment, he remembered that he had taken it out to pay for Katie's drink. He didn't know where he lost it, so he started by checking the house and car before finally calling Corral to ask the manager if the lost wallet had been found. Looks like its wallet disappeared, and he decided that he would do without it. His first concern was that no one would use his credit cards, so he spent the next half hour on calls to block them. By midnight, Andy had made all the necessary preparations and finally went to bed. Now that he had decided what to do, thoughts of Katie and her new lover no longer plagued him. He was able to fall asleep without much difficulty and woke up relatively rested. In the light of a new day, he began to reconsider his decisions made the day before. He thought it over again and came to the conclusion that he could see no way out of what Katie had done to hurt him. She did it too well. Once he had convinced himself of this again, he began to carry out his plan. In about 2 hours, Andy calmly gathered some of his clothes and put a few personal items in the car. Their house was rented, and he left the keys on the kitchen table. He thought about leaving his wedding ring, but couldn't bring himself to take it off. While he was thinking about the ring, twisting it on his finger, he almost gave up his plan and even tried to convince himself that he could come to terms with the fact that he had become Katie's cuckold. In the end, he realized that his original plan was the only reasonable solution for him. Just before 10 a.m., he called Katie's cell phone. There was no answer, so he called Cindy. He was able to talk to Cindy, but learned that Katie was not there and that Cindy had not spoken to her since the previous day. His last call to Tara White's number, which he found in Kathy's phone book, went unanswered. He didn't want to do this, but he had no choice. He had to leave Katie a letter instead of speaking to her in person. He knew she might not be available all weekend, and he needed to deal with it now. It tormented him, and he didn't think he could sit idly by waiting for Katie, the time he knew that will hold, reconsidering her decision and tormenting herself with pictures of her betrayals. Later, looking back, he will realize that his thinking was not entirely rational or wise. For now, however, his solution was the only one he could come up with. He took a pen and paper and began to write. Dear Katie, I'm so sorry that I ruined everything like that for us. If I could undo what happened in Columbus, I would do it instantly, but I can't. Obviously, there's probably nothing I could have said or done to make up for what you saw there. What you decided to do as punishment is too much for me. I can't live here knowing that many people will talk about what you did to me as revenge. By the time your friends and Tiny and everyone else at the corral talk about it, I won't be able to lift my head anywhere in town. I cannot and will not live my life with everyone whispering cuckold behind my back. Last night, I lost my wallet somewhere. It wasn't picked up at corral, so I blocked my credit cards. Without these cards and driver's license, I will have to use our account overdraft and retrieve my passport and birth certificate from the safe deposit box. Don't worry about the money. My commission check will cover the overdraft and leave you with enough to start over without me. Please donate my items to charity or someone who can use them. I emailed my boss after quitting my job and asked that any salary and commissions I was owed be deposited into a bank account. I will always love you, Katie. I really regret that we never had children. Andy. When he finished the letter, Andy left it on the table along with the house keys. He left the house, locking the door behind him one last time. He got into the car and drove away without looking back. Now he didn't think, he just acted, following his plan to the end. After one stop at a bank, where he withdrew some cash and collected his personal documents, he went to the interstitial freeway and headed north. Nearly 17 months have passed since Andy Carlson returned to his former hometown near Indianapolis. He arrived in the city at noon and then spent the day doing necessary business. That evening, after dinner, he drove up to the house he used to share with Katie. It took him a couple of minutes to mentally prepare himself before he finally got out of the car and headed towards the house. As he approached the door, he hesitated before ringing the bell and quickly checked the inside pocket of his jacket, making sure the envelope was there. When he felt the thickness of it in his pocket, he pressed the bell button. And he could hear the bell ringing quietly inside the house, and his nervousness grew as he waited. He had been anticipating and dreading this moment ever since he decided to return. As the sounds of Katie's footsteps grew louder as she approached the door, Andy's heart race was pounding in the chest. As soon as the door began to open, he held his breath. When she opened the door, Katie looked at Andy without any expression, apparently not understanding who he was. That changed within 2 or 3 seconds as surprise crossed her face, and then she said, "Andy, you're alive." She barely had time to say those words before Andy saw her eyes roll back into her head and her body begin to fall to the floor. Andy managed to grab her hands to gently lower her to the floor. She didn't respond when he spoke to her, so he picked her up and carried her into the living room, where he laid her on the sofa. A quick check showed that she was breathing normally, so he went to the bathroom to get a cold, damp washcloth to place on her face. When he returned a few seconds later, she was still unconscious, so he began to gently wipe her face. After a few seconds, she began to come to her senses. Andy was kneeling next to her, and when she came to, she looked around confused, trying to figure out where she was. After a few seconds, her eyes focused on his face, and she said, "Andy, I thought you were dead. Where were you? I've been looking for you since you left." "Why did you think I was dead? What do you mean when you said you were looking for me?" Katie raised her right hand and gently touched his face, as if checking whether he was really in front of her. As she looked at him, she noticed that his hair had become a little longer and a few wrinkles had appeared on his previously youthful face. "When I found out you were gone, I did everything I could to find you. I even hired a detective, and he couldn't find any trace of you. He had connections with the state police and the FBI, and even though he didn't, I didn't find any. You haven't applied for new credit cards anywhere, your social security number hasn't appeared anywhere in the country, and you haven't renewed your driver's license anywhere. How could that be if you're here in front of me now?" And he watched Katie as she spoke and noticed that she, too, had changed from the image he had in his mind. Her hair was much longer, she seemed thinner, and she wasn't wearing makeup, something he never remembered doing before. "I guess they didn't check Canada. Don't you remember I was born there? I went there right from here and was in Toronto the whole time. They don't use the same social security numbers, and I now have an Ontario driver's license. My credit card's at the Bank of Montreal." For a few seconds, they just looked at each other, retrieving their memories. Andy spoke first. "How are you doing, Katie? You look good. I think you're with someone now. Are you staying with Bob Sherman or Eric Mitchell?" Katie's face tensed and tears sparkled in her eyes. She blinked a couple of times before saying, "I never dated Bob or Eric. This was all a setup to get back at you. You left town a couple of hours before I came to tell you the truth and to end your suffering. I realized that the second time was too much. I saw it in your eyes as soon as Tiny came to kick you out of the bar. I went out to talk to you in the parking lot, but you were already leaving that night. Stayed with Tara to give you one last night of suffering." While Katie was telling this, Andy's face lost all expression, and he turned away as tears appeared in his eyes. "Are you saying you haven't slept with anyone?" Andy looked at Katie again, trying to gauge the truth of her words by the look in her eyes as she answered the question. Katie looked Andy straight in the eye as she said, "That's right. It was all a setup to hurt you like you hurt me. I'm so sorry, Andy." Andy could see without a doubt that she was telling the truth. Andy stood up and moved to the chair next to the couch where Katie was sitting. "I know you're with someone right now because I saw a razor and a toothbrush in the bathroom. Is this serious?" Andy looked at her calmly, waiting for an answer. Katie sat down on the couch before answering. "I met someone at work a few months ago. His name is Joseph Harper. We don't live together. Sometimes he stays over. I really thought you were dead." She had been looking away as she said this, and now turned to look at Andy directly. Andy blinked a couple of times to hold back his tears before speaking. "I met someone too. Her name is Monique Dion. She's French-Canadian. We started living together about 5 months ago. She's waiting for me at the hotel. I really had to start living again. I went to a psychologist, and she told me that I need to move on after what happened." Katie sat on the couch with her legs curled under her and both hands covering her mouth. Andy couldn't be sure, but he thought she was crying. Andy knew he had to tell the whole story of his visit, so he continued, "She's the reason for my visit. I came back to straighten things out. Her family is Catholic, and they don't approve of us just living together. They'd like us to get married." Andy hesitated, catching his breath and looking at Katie to see her reaction to his words. She did not change her position, but he saw that her tears flowed down my cheeks. Andy steeled himself to continue. "I spent the day with a lawyer preparing all the paperwork for a no-fault divorce. I brought papers for you to sign." Andy took an envelope out of his pocket. It was not sealed, and he carefully took out the folded documents. "You have one set for you, and one set that you need to sign." Andy spoke mechanically, aligning the forms and taking out a pen. "The places to sign are marked in red." He placed his pen and papers on the coffee table in front of Katie, then moved to sit next to her. All this time, she looked at the documents without moving, with her hands to her mouth. She didn't try to speak as Andy talked about Monica and the reason for his visit. After staring at the papers for a few seconds, Katie turned her face to Andy and asked, "You want a divorce? Is that the reason you're coming back?" Andy knew he had to continue the story. He took a deep breath before speaking. "She's pregnant. We're going to have a baby. We want to get married before the baby is born, if possible." Katie covered her mouth with her hands again and turned away so he couldn't see her eyes. He could tell she was definitely crying as her shoulders were shaking slightly. He put his arm around her shoulders. "I'm so sorry, Katie. I really ruined a good marriage." Katie began to calm down as he held her and finally said, "It's not all your fault, Andy. I should have talked to you instead of trying to punish you. I'll regret this for the rest of my life." "Don't blame yourself, Katie. I'm the one who ended up in bed with that girl. No one else is to blame, only me. If I had never lost my way, none of this would have happened." Katie was calmer now. She turned to Andy and said, "She called me, you know. About 2 weeks after you left, she called to see how we got along. She admitted that she seduced you. She told me what she did." The surprise on Andy's face was obvious. "You mean Brenda called you?" Andy thought for a moment before adding, "No matter what she did, I could. I should have said no. I didn't." They sat next to each other for a few more minutes, silent. Finally, Katie took a pen and signed the forms in the correct places. When she finished, Andy neatly folded the papers, leaving her copies on the table. He clearly had difficulty getting up and putting his copies in his jacket pocket. They walked together silently to the front door, where they embraced. Andy, backing away, said, "I'm sorry, Katie." "I'm sorry too, Andy." They both wiped away their tears as Andy opened the front door and left. Katie walked over to the living room window and continued to stare down the street for several minutes after Andy's car was out of sight. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.